Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all, we taking it back.
Welcome to Left to Black. We're joined today by Professor David A. Varel, who is the author of The Lost Black Scholar, Resurrecting Allison Davis, and a American social thought, published by the University of Chicago Press 2018, and the recently published The Scholar and the Struggle, Lawrence Reddick's Crusade for Black History and Black Power, which was published by our friends 8 miles down the road, the University of North Carolina Press. Of the scholar and the Struggle, Stephen G. Hall writes, an exceedingly important intervention. Varel's work will complement and extend, as well as play an integral part in the expansion of African American intellectual history and historiography. How are you doing today, David?
Oh, I'm doing pretty good. How about you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for joining us here on Left to Black. I'm reading Jane Smethurst's work on the Black Power movement in the South. Lawrence Reddick's name comes up. I'm reading Vanessa Valdez's work on both, Arthur Schomburg, but also, what's happening in terms of the relationship between Haiti and its relationship to what's happening in Puerto Rico and Cuba and other, Afro-Caribbean countries. Lawrence Reddick's name comes up. This is a name that in recent years I find coming up in so many different contexts, especially as the second director of the very well-known and famous Schomburg Library. Who was Lawrence Reddick, right? And why has he seemed to have been obscured in the archives of Black intellectual history?
Yeah, and I like you kind of saying that because the point of the book ultimately became to kind of, tell his full story. And, because a lot of people do know, facets of it because he was in all these spaces, but to kind of provide the full narrative really is pretty striking. And, but yeah, so just a few of those things we can return to. He kind of came of age in the 1930s, rooted in the Black history movement. He studied at Fisk for his undergrad and master's, then got his PhD at the University of Chicago in history in 1939. All the while, he's very much part of Carter Woodson's network and sort of building up ASALA, publishing Journal of Negro History, compiling sources, interviewing former slaves. He was instrumental in that process of getting slave narratives that later the WPA took up and did more of. Then it's during that period during World War II and shortly thereafter that he is the curator of the Schomburg Library. He kind of gets it renamed the Schomburg Library after Arthur Schomburg died in 1938. And then he becomes a librarian at Atlanta University for about 7 years during the Cold War. Then has this kind of really momentous kind of turn by going to Montgomery, Alabama as a professor, and then befriends and becomes really close with Martin Luther King, Ralph Abernathy, becomes a founder of SCLC, and really becomes a key part of that whole movement and through the 1960s. And then finally, the last phase of his career takes him into sort of Temple University, and we kind of, is part of the struggle to build up a kind of Black studies at Temple and challenge institutional racism at some of these predominantly white universities.
You mentioned he went to Fisk and this moment of the Black history movement. One of his classmates is John Hope Franklin, for example. But one of the things that also happens when he's at Fisk is he becomes a member of Phi Beta Sigma. That's something I actually didn't know until I read your book. I'm a member of Phi Beta Sigma. So to read that particular aspect of his history and how his voice was so important to politicizing some of the activities of Phi Beta Sigma at the time, his role as the editor of the Crescent. Talk a little bit about how it was important for a figure like Reddick to be able to meld, his work as a scholar, as an activist, with also the activity that he's doing in fraternal organizations like Phi Beta Sigma.
Yeah, it becomes a really important part of his career. And I think it just shows all the ways, the different spaces he was in. And these Black fraternities were really essential, just providing a kind of type of community, a social setting for many of these figures who are often kind of isolated in different places across the country. And so they're important for that right alone. But Reddick, always politically minded, is kind of thinking, okay, how can we take this body of, impressive, often somewhat affluent African Americans and use them to use their political power, whatever they have, to also fight for these broader issues of, whether it's giving more attention to African American history or just for supporting civil rights struggles in different means. So yeah, he kind of edited the Crescent. He co-wrote a history of the organization in the 50s, and he kind of did that, kind of told a kind of interesting kind of social story about the people involved in Phi Beta Sigma, but also always connecting it to sort of figures like Kwame Nkrumah and these big Sigma brothers who were also part of this global freedom struggle, and trying to make those connections part of the larger story of the organization.
I mean, he brings St. Clair Drake in. Phi Beta Sigma is another kind of example of the work that he was doing. He makes an interesting choice, right? He's trained as a historian, and he decides to go into the field of library sciences, right? And as you talk about in the book, he never saw them, he saw them as complementary. But he really does shift from this role of solely historian to one of curator. What kind of choice do you think motivated his decision to go in that direction? And if you think he hadn't gone in that direction, would he have been able to sustain himself career-wise, professionally, as simply a historian?
Yeah, that's a good counterfactual. Hard to know, but I do know that this Black history movement, it was, as Carter Woodson and others organized it, right? It was very much about, you have to collect these Black voices, these Black sources, before we can necessarily write these powerful revisionist studies. And so even early on, there was always a real focus on compiling, finding sources in new ways, documenting activities that are currently unfolding. And so I think in that sense, it was really a very natural kind of evolution towards becoming the curator of the Schomburg, where he is still doing intellectual writing of his own creative work, but he's also charged with developing a library and acquiring sources and presenting those to the public. But yeah, I think it's interesting how much that work does kind of rejuvenate his career in different ways. And it makes him a kind of real public intellectual during this crucial period of World War II, where he befriends Nkrumah and Du Bois and others. So yeah, it never goes away from him in that sort of library aspect of the struggle. Even for STLC, right? He becomes officially their kind of historian who's also documenting in detail, collecting all these papers on King, recording what the MIA and these different organizations are doing. So just knowing like he's a participant, but also this archivist, even as he's doing it, is really fascinating role. But
you mentioned in the book, one of his peers at the time, says to him, taking this job, you now effectively become the dean of Negro history in this country. And to the point that you made, it's something you obviously took very seriously and helped to cultivate. One of the challenges, if you are Lawrence Reddick in your career, is that you don't distinguish your work as a historian from your work from a curator, from your work as an activist, right? And again, we're talking about him working most often in his career in the Jim Crow South, where the presidents of different different HBCUs are doing a certain kind of dance, right? If they're state colleges, they're beholden to a legislature and a governor. Even those who were private are still dealing with realities of Jim Crow segregation. So it often put his political activity at odds with the leadership of these institutions in terms of what they needed to do to just keep the train moving down the track. And some of the movement that you see in his career literally has to do with folks saying, you got to go. For whatever reasons. Talk a little bit about that dynamic of Reddick's career.
Yeah, no, it was striking how it just seems to keep happening, in sometimes quite different organizations. And really almost every organization he left, there was often some sort of controversial end. It's not always clear why, but the first one at kind of Dillard University, where he worked in the late 1930s, he left under kind of mysterious ends. It was pretty clear that he was kind of pushed out.
Yeah.
And so was St. Clair Drake a few years later, we know, because of his involvement with civil rights protests. And I'm pretty sure it was similar for Reddick. And then Atlanta University has a real conflict with the Black president there, Rufus Clement. Again, it was striking back and forth there. I can't know all of what unfolded there. There did seem to be some rather personal clashes, as well as you say, kind of his political involvement was at odds.
I mean, that exchange is really particularly interesting because, it begged a couple of questions, right? The president is essentially telling him that you're not around to run the library, not explicitly naming what he might have been done. And Reddick's offer, let's sit down and talk about what this intellectual labor is. And it strikes me that, not just for what's happening in Atlanta at that time, but for many of these presidents who are dealing with this new generation of Black intellectuals, there wasn't quite a clear sense of what the work of being a certain kind of intellectual beyond the scope of your discipline, right? The math professors are teaching math, the literature, right? The historians are really doing something else, right? They're capturing a history, but they're also putting out a kind of political commentary at that time. And I wonder how many, in the president's defense, how many other college and university presidents at the HBCU knew how to deal with this new generation of scholar and activists.
Right. No, that's a good question. Yeah. And yeah, there really is sometimes a clash in how they can manage this institutions in the Jim Crow world while still sort of having these professors who are maybe boldly challenging it in public that's angering some of these kind of white figures in those states. So it was a trick.
There is a kind of Forrest Gump sensibility, to Reddick's life and career. He seems to be on the scene where certain things are happening. So you mentioned Fisk in the 1930s. He goes down to Dillard, the important work that he does helping, the WPA be able to collect these slave narratives or narratives of enslaved Blacks while in Dillard, right? He goes up to New York, which not only positions him in a certain kind of way in terms of being the archivist and curator of the Schomburg, but also introduces him to a Black internationalism, right, that he didn't experience in the South, that he gets introduced to in New York because New York is New York in that particular moment. And then he ends up, back down South and ends up in this unique moment, watershed beginning moments of the civil rights movement, which brings him to SCLC and his relationship with King. There's always been this aspect of Reddick's intellectual production, we'll talk about in a moment, which always was connected to what he was doing at the time, right? So it's almost as if he's functioning as a literary documentarian for his activities at any particular given moment. But what was it like for him to be down in Alabama in this moment around the birth of SCLC and functioning with, these very important folks who would dramatically shift, whether we're talking King or Ella Baker for the time that she was there, would have such an important role, a decade down the road in terms of civil rights in the U.S.
Yeah, I think I tried to imagine what it was like for him I think it was just kind of shocking and overwhelming in a way, because it was only a couple months after he arrived that, this bus boycott really took off. And so he's kind of there just taking up the head of this, this HBCU, head of the history department. And suddenly you got all this activity on the grassroots led by these kind of, charismatic ministers and women like Joanne Robinson. And so he's thrown right into the middle of that, and now trying to help out whatever way he can, kind of organize the struggle, publicize it, tell to the world what's happening. And I don't know, it must have been thrilling and just somewhat overwhelming as he did that. Yeah. But from there forward, his 5 years in Montgomery before he got, again, forcefully basically removed by the, governor.
Right.
It was just kind of one thing after another. Suddenly he's this close mentor of this figure who comes to embody the whole Black freedom struggle, Martin Luther King. He mentors him, helps write the first biography of him. traveling to India with the man. I mean, he's just, yeah, he must have been so invigorated.
You mentioned the King books, really the first autobiography, and then also the book that he does that goes along with that. And that note that he sent St. Clair Drake a decade earlier when he first gets to the Schomburg, he's like, there's just so much stuff here. There's something wrong with me if I don't knock out 3 or 4 books, when I'm here. And of course, that doesn't happen, right? And what you see, part of the reason why we don't think about Reddick the way that we do, because he never had the time to write that signature monograph, right? Likably, like the Du Bois and some of the other folks that we would go, oh yeah, we know who this person is, right? Even St. Clair Drake.
Yeah.
But it often seems as though his publishing career, he gave up his personal goals as an intellectual to write about these incredible movements, right? So whether we're talking about him co-writing a history of the Sigmas, or the work that he's doing with King, or the little book that he does, a decade later, when he's working with the OIC, he understood needing to accommodate his own intellectual sensibilities to forward the kind of work that he was doing. I mean, you mentioned in the book that with each one of these new movements to new organizations, new places, he picks up a new skill set. And for the time that he's working with SCLC, right, he becomes a publicist, right? And some of his intellectual career is really aligned with this idea of publicizing and helping to broaden the knowledge of what was happening in terms of, some of the political activities that he was engaged in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it really was a kind of, a selfless act in a way, is that he is kind of sidelining some of the intellectual work studies he might have liked to do this other type of work, so that is why maybe we don't know him as well. But I think that once we do know him, I think it becomes even more impressive for having done that. And we get to realize just how collective these struggles are, all the different things that intellectuals are doing, as well as the spokespeople, the ordinary people, the protesters. There's just these many layers that he really, I think, helps kind of show what that looks like a bit.
In the mid-1960s, he's in Maryland and Coppin State when he gets drawn into Leon Sullivan's organization, the OIC. Talk a little bit about the work of the OIC and what Reddick brought to that organization when he joined.
Sure. So the OIC kind of grew out of this movement by Leon Sullivan, kind of charismatic, 6'5", Baptist preacher. Who basically, he had kind of pioneered these boycotts or selective patronage campaigns to, kind of don't buy where you can't work campaigns. He used that successfully to open up jobs to new people, new Black people, especially. But he found that, a lot of times the Black community, through generations of poverty and lack of education, weren't always equipped to take on some of those jobs. So it became a kind of practical organization to give skill to that community to make sure that those economic gains could be passed on to these Black workers. And so it built from, the Great Society, the kind of anti-poverty programs at the time, to try to meet this practical, urgent need among especially Black urban communities for jobs. And so Lawrence Reddick takes up the role of kind of the trainer of managers who kind of form their own OIC units in different cities across the country, to teach them how to recruit people, how to develop this organization, make them successful. And so, I always find one of the most striking things that he did, in addition to kind of publicizing what the OIC is, what it does, was that how much he made Black history a centerpiece of that training for these managers. I have this one part in the book which it looks like this really daunting, college or graduate exam of kind of talking about, okay, identify these key African leaders and this figure, what did they do? And, like 5 minutes to write all this about these people. But it's like, it shows how much that for him, just like Carter Woodson a long time ago, that historical knowledge was tied to empowerment as a Black person. See yourself as part of a generations long struggle of a community, and that will allow you to empower some of those kind of poor Black people who are just trying to make do on the in these urban communities. But
Reddick, of course, is of that generation of Black historians who would have been alive and thriving, who would become from the first generation of Black scholars to show up on PWI campuses, which is the case with Reddick when he gets hired at Temple in the early 1970s. And, what is this burgeoning moment of new Black studies departments? What was his relationship with PWIs? And particularly talk a little bit about his relationship with Alex Haley, for the time that he's in Philadelphia.
Yeah, so again, Reddick's kind of doing similar type of work in terms of wanting to find new sources on the Black experience, the Black diasporic experience. And so, yeah, his encounter with Alex Haley becomes a fascinating one where they embark on this ambitious kind of global library research project on Black families in Africa to the Americas and beyond, and to record and compile what some of those voices were like. Again, this is something that I think is kind of overshadowed by how successful Haley was in his own sort of Roots project and what a TV sensation that became.
Right.
But, Reddick was very much doing a similar type of work of trying to connect these different families and produce a database that people could consult to tell those kinds of stories, which blew the American public away in a sense. But yeah.
I'm curious, what has drawn you as a historian to these stories, these histories of these figures who have been obscured, from Black intellectual history, whether it's Allison Davis, which was the case with your first book, and obviously Lawrence Reddick now. What has drawn you to these figures and doing this kind of intellectual work?
Yeah, I guess a lot of things. It kind of started out, the Allison Davis project was a kind of based on my dissertation, and it was on a kind of a practical thing of how do I contribute to this field of US intellectual history? And I think that it's a continued thing that field, like most scholarly fields, Black people and Black scholars were marginalized for so long that those are still the dynamic areas in which new scholarship, new voices, new perspectives can be produced. And so that was definitely the case with, both of these figures. I think that they bring on a sort of critical perspective to whether it's anthropology and sociology or history that help us as historians rethink those eras better, but also documenting their own lives gives a kind of social history of what did institutional racism look like during the mid 20th century. And so that too was a important interest of me, for sure. But
yeah, thank you. We've been joined today by Professor David I. Varel, who's the author of The Lost Black Scholar, Resurrecting Allison Davis in American Social Thought, published by the University of Chicago Press in 2018, and his most recent book, The Scholar and the Struggle, Lawrence Reddick's Crusade for Black History and Black Power, published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2021, of which Stephen G. Hall writes, an exceedingly important intervention. Varel's work will complement and extend, as well as play an integral part in the expansion of African-American intellectual history and historiography. Thank you for joining us today, David.
thank you very much.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for watch.